Utopia promises safety, perfection, answers. But in a culture of breakneck progress and rapid prototyping, learning, and sometimes our survival, depends on a willingness to experiment and fail. To be comfortable with questions and cognizant of what we don't know, how do we cultivate learning communities where mistakes are expected and honored, both in our communities and our organizations? Failures of all sizes will be shared. Answers will be sparse, but there will be plenty of questions. The next presentation is going to start at the top of the hour, which is 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Okay, see you all in a little bit. Hey everyone, I just want to take a couple minutes here to remind you that you can adjust your audio by using your computer's volume controls. If you are viewing this conference as a group and you haven't done so already, please let us know the name of your library or group and the number of people with you today. Or if you want, you can just send us at SEFLIN a group registration sign-in sheet. This conference is brought to you by SEFLIN, the Southeast Florida Library Information Network, and has been funded under the provisions of the Library Cooperative Grant Program, administered by the Florida Department of State's Division of Library and Information Services. The conference is being recorded and will be available within 2 weeks to all registered attendees. If you haven't done so already, please follow us on Twitter at SEFLINLIB, SEFLINLib, and use the hashtag SEFLINVC for virtual conference 17, SEFLINVC 17. All right, we will be joined by Nate Stone in about 10 minutes at 1 o'clock. Okay, welcome back to the SEFLIN 2017 virtual conference on Digital Utopia, Libraries Building Communities of Learning. We hope you found some really useful ideas there in our pre-recorded panel discussion. Before I introduce our next presenter, Nate Stone, I want to make sure his mic is working. Nate, are you there?
Hi, how's it going?
Good, how are you? Okay, good. So your mic is working. So let's learn a little bit about Nate, and then he can teach us all some stuff about what they're doing at Denver. So like I said, our next session features Nate Stone. Nate is the Idea Lab Program Administrator at the Denver Public Library in Denver, Colorado, where he oversees design, programming, and training in DPL's makerspaces. An avid artist, musician, and maker throughout his life, Nate came to libraries through years of work in the nonprofit sector, in informal education, youth development, and advocacy. When he's not cursing the CNC machine he's supposed to be helping patrons with, he enjoys digging in the garden with his children. We are happy to provide Nate a reprieve from his CNC machine, so everyone, let's welcome Nate.
So thanks for having me. I'm here to start talking about failure. So let's hope the rest of my presentation isn't a case study of what that looks like. My name is Nate Stone. As I said, I'm the Idea Lab Program Administrator for the Denver Public Libraries, which means I'm responsible for designing and stocking our makerspaces, hiring and training staff to run those makerspaces, and developing the community partnerships that bring new people and new skills into those spaces. Thanks a lot for having me speak today. Thank you for your patience as we got started, and for Melanie for putting up with all my weird scheduling stuff. I hope everyone is doing okay in Florida now. I'm taking the sign that this is happening at all as a positive one. So today I wanted to talk about failure and the role that it plays in getting us closer to the utopia promised in the conference theme. It may seem a little contradictory at first, failure and utopia, I guess until you read any history about utopias, but my subject was prompted by two main ideas. Number one, we're often asked to be innovative in our organizations, but our libraries may not necessarily make the adjustments needed to actually support innovation. And what that usually means is being able to handle failure in a productive manner. Number two, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that we're all here because we want our communities to succeed. Knowing how to learn from failure is, in my belief, the single most important skill we can impart to our communities, and we're going to touch on that a lot. So I'd like to talk about how we help both our libraries and our patrons fail. How do we help them fail successfully? Which means that I'll be talking a lot about the ways that I've failed, and I've done that a lot. In preparing for this talk, I came across, it started me thinking about anything in JavaScript. It happens in most programming languages, but if you, in JavaScript, if you want to test out a piece of code, there's a structure where you can say, I want to try something. So it says try, and then inside that try, you throw out what you're testing out. Then there's a catch. And the catch means that if you have any errors, you can plan ahead for them. If something goes wrong with the code, I can do, if X goes wrong with the code, I can do this. If Y goes wrong with the code, I can do that. And it got me thinking about how rarely we plan for errors in real life. For most of my life, and for most of the organizations I've worked for, I think we'd probably have to rewrite it to be something like this. Where there is no, in fact, no planning for failure, just you assume that it won't happen at all. Most webinars I've been to, most conferences I've been to, take the form of sort of case studies of utopias, right? I can't tell you how insanely jealous I've been going to different conferences and hearing about these amazing spaces or these amazing programs. And I could do that for all of you today. I could just show you pictures of the inside of the Idea Lab, where it makes it look like every day I have tiny, adorable children paired with adult mentors who are working in the programming field, and they're learning side by side, and everything is beautiful, and roses grow everywhere. But the reality is that for every one of these pictures I have 500 more that look something like this. This is a photo of my latest maker in residence, a very, very sweet guy who's setting up a game that no one will play with him because he's an hour and a half late to his event, and about as approachable as a textbook on like Marxist cultural analysis. Whose bright idea was this program? I'll give you a hint. His name rhymes with crate phone. But I'm already making a mistake. Let me share with you a big failure that I've lived through and the lessons that my mentors taught me through it. So we got our first 3D printer about 4 years ago at the Central Library in Denver. We got it right when our initial makerspace had evolved from this grubby looking closet of a caterpillar closet into a beautiful butterfly of a room with windows and functioning HVAC. My first thought when we got it was how can we get as many people as possible using the 3D printer? I don't think that's a bad first thought to have. I like to think of it as a noble and mission-driven sort of thought, but it's not the only one people should have when they start a new program. But that's what I did. What I did was I made a form on the DPL webpage where anyone could upload a file to be printed. I put up a blog post telling people how awesome the 3D printer was and how they could submit files. And then I went back to trying to figure out how to make the printer make anything besides plastic spaghetti, because, like I said, we had just gotten it. But I came back from my weekend off, and I discovered that we had a ridiculous number of jobs submitted. Within the first 48 hours, we had something like 300 jobs, which ended up taking me and the rest of the staff I worked with about 3 months to work through. And not only were there too many jobs, but most of them were just these absolutely insane requests, things like gasoline tanks for motorcycles or full-sized Iron Man armor, which were not only like dangerous, but would take days, not hours to print. To compound all of that excitement, we very quickly found out that customers who submitted a request one time through a web form maybe didn't have any particular incentive to come in and actually pick up the thing that they had requested. Our pickup rate after the first month was hovering around 20%, representing hundreds of hours of essentially lost staff time. So we shut down the webpage, fielded calls for several weeks from irate customers, and I sat down to have an unpleasant meeting with my boss, or what I had anticipated would be an unpleasant meeting. It took an entirely different tack when the first question she asked wasn't who did this, which was me, but what happened, which brings me back to my first idea that inspired this particular subject here. Libraries, like nearly every institution in our society, are constantly being pushed to innovate. This has been the case for long enough at DPL that they've institutionalized it. They've created a position for a manager of innovation. And there's several reasons for this. Key among them, right, is libraries trying to fight the tired narrative that we're somehow irrelevant in the internet age. But I feel like I've seen a common problem arise in a bunch of different places. Very often, someone's executive team will go out to a design thinking seminar over the weekend, and they'll come back and have a new model that they want to share with the rest of the staff, and they'll tell you to start empathizing with your public and iterate and start new things, and you're supposed to go out and innovate, and you, being the amazing, awesome employee you are, filled with great ideas, goes out and tries something, and it fails because things fail all the time, and suddenly no one can remember exactly who it was that told you to try new things, but we certainly didn't mean what you just did when you tried it. Organizations that truly learn from failure have a couple key behaviors. There's been some fascinating studies, most of them focused around the healthcare industry, that look at how organizations respond or don't to failure. I've found the work of Amy Edmondson from the Harvard Business School has been particularly enlightening on this case, but one of the key features that helps organizations learn from failure is being able to disengage failure from fault. In other words, fixing the problem is more important than fixing blame. And you can see how this would fundamentally change the culture of a place by looking at the actual root of the problem, rather than hanging it around a single person's neck. You open it up to actually solve the larger organizational problems that caused everything, and you also avoid the problem of teaching people, inadvertently or not, that bringing problems up to be fixed just means that you'll be shown the door. That, luckily enough, wasn't what happened to me. By focusing on the real problem, which was a resource problem, that if we wanted to offer 3D printing as a service for our patrons, we had to set some sort of limits, that demand was high enough. We also had to figure out how to incentivize picking up the prints, and a way to vet the prints so that we could avoid wasted staff time. We were able to come to solutions collectively because the problem wasn't buried with an individual. It wasn't buried on me. Our answer ended up being to limit print jobs to 2 hours max, and only accept submissions in person, where staff could talk with the patron. They could set clear expectations. We could vet the model before time, which saved us a lot of time on the back end. And we found that once people came in person, it was generally enough proof that they would come back again to actually pick up the print, that our pickup rate went up to about 90%. The other key lesson that I want to draw from this particular problem, this particular failure, this particular experiment in making my coworkers' lives terrible for 3 months, was how we structured our solutions. So we have some pals in the Arapahoe Library District, which is just next door to us in the metro area, and they ran into the exact same situation. They bought a printer, they got overwhelmed with demand, but they came up with a very different solution to it. And core reason for that is that we had different goals, right? And it was only by keeping those goals in the forefront of our discussions about the failure itself that we were able to coherently respond to it at all. The same organizational literature I mentioned earlier refers to this as framing the work accurately, providing the right context for your work, why you're doing something. So the essential failure at hand was a resource problem. It took too much staff time to print all the things for all the people. We set time limits on submissions, but left them open to whatever people wanted to bring in, because our end goal, our mission, has always been to encourage the people that we serve to be producers rather than consumers. We wanted our community to be able to print the things that they designed. ALD's goals revolve around exposure. They believe that the best role that their library can play in their community is to give as many people access as possible to the chance to see cutting-edge technology. So their solution, stemming from that goal, was to limit prints to a preset library. Patrons would come in and leaf through a booklet, find a print that they liked, and that booklet was limited to just prints that they knew worked. They set up the machines and trained the staff so that any staff member in the library could come and just print one of those 50 models, and the patron could walk away with it. I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're not. They're just different ways to offer 3D printing as a service in our libraries. The key point I want to make is that they're both informed by thought out explicit goals and missions that preceded the experiment, right? Which enabled us to frame our response to the failure in a meaningful way. If I tell you, for example, if I tell you that your job is to build the highest tower possible with just printer paper, as we told these kids at a web development camp to do, the way that you measure failure in that, and the way that you measure your progress against other people, is really easy to see. It's whether your floppy tower falls over before someone else's. If I bought a 3D printer because admin told me to, or because I just thought it was cool, I'd have no way to frame my response to failure. The majority of our work life, what a failure is or not, it tends to be far more opaque than building a paper tower, right? What I'm trying to say is, if we want our organizations, our libraries, to be able to learn and respond to challenges and deal with failure meaningfully, we have to cultivate the why of our work in a very explicit way. Everyone has to have it embedded in all the work that they do. And when we have those sort of clear signposts, the way to respond to setbacks becomes much, much clearer. If you can't already tell from my presentation, structure and limits aren't things that necessarily come naturally to me. It's probably why I ended up in makerspaces. But I'd like to share another failure that made me realize how important they are for successful learning, both for our patrons and for organizations. The picture you can see here is one of my favorite pictures ever. It's from our dev camp, which is a summer camp we do that lasts a week for teens 12 to 19. They learn front-end web development. They work with mentors in the field to create a website for a client by the end of the week. We have guest speakers come in, and this particular picture was taken as this amazing guest speaker came in who was talking about product design. He stood up in front of a group of 13-year-old kids and started his speech by saying, "You're all familiar with agile software development, right? If you don't know what agile software development is, that's okay. You're not a programmer." Neither was the room of 13-year-old kids. This look of bewilderment that you see on this kid trying to tell me to get this presenter to talk English to him is a look that I've seen a little bit too often inside my classrooms. Keeping learners engaged is always a tricky thing, and it can be even harder with teens. Libraries being informal learning spaces, we want to provide opportunities that don't feel like school, right? That the default response to that particular challenge is to offer more freedom, to leave exploration as the goal, to make things more open-ended. The positive part about that is that this opens up chances for our students to engage with the material on their own terms, to find a way into it that is meaningful for them. But finding the right balance between structure and freedom can be tricky. So, for example, we wanted to do some coding classes with kids, and we bumped into some folks in our community who wanted to start a program called Coder Dojo. And I want to clarify before we start that before I say anything else, the Coder Dojo is this international organization. They just got folded into the Raspberry Pi Foundation. They do amazing work. They started in Ireland, and they've got Coder Dojo clubs all over the world. All I'm sharing is just our particular experience with a very particular group of volunteers and staff members. But we started off really heavily invested in the absolute freedom to explore. The idea was that kids would come in, we'd tell them that this is a place to learn how to code together, and then we'd let them loose and they'd make amazing things. We'd provide a room, computers, and mentors would be there to help them, but otherwise the kids would drive everything. They'd drive their own learning. And as a coordinator, this sounded like a dream program, right? We wouldn't have to spend staff time that I didn't have to create lesson plans or materials. Kids would be coding, which everyone loves. Volunteers would be helping out their community. Dogs and cats would finally live in peace. It would be this amazing, amazing experience. So we had a kickoff session, and 20 kids showed up with their parents, and we handed out computers, and our volunteer who was leading that session introduced everyone and then said, "Let's start coding." And the kids and the parents sort of looked around. Eventually the kids started playing games. The group thought, okay, well, we want this to be interest-driven. We don't want to have classes. We don't want a class, but we can give maybe ideas to start. So one of the volunteers made a sheet that was like a my first website kind of exercise with a couple step-by-step instructions to introduce them to HTML. We handed that out the next week. Everyone in the room took a copy. And things went okay at first. Kids made some neat websites, and then people started asking for the next sheet. And the volunteer leading that session said, "We don't have another worksheet, but what would you like to do next? Let's start coding." And everyone sort of looked around again, and kids started playing games. We eventually made a couple more worksheets. Some people suggested that we actually, I don't know, teach something. But the core of the group was really heavily invested in this idea that the kids driving their own learning meant no teaching, no structure. And so we watched the group dwindle. We watched parents and kids get frustrated. They would ask for direction, and mentors would point them to resources that they couldn't understand. Mentors and staff got angry when they were constantly jumping back and forth between parents and families that were angry. We gave the program a solid 6 months and had several conversations amongst the group about how we could restructure things, but there was a core that was committed to that lack of structure. We eventually had made the decision to kill it, to kill the program, or to be more honest, the decision was made for us as there was one kid in the last 2 sessions. So what happened? There was a lot that went wrong there, obviously, but here's one of the more important lessons that I drew from it. We as a group had talked a lot about giving kids the chance to fail, that freedom opens up the chance to experiment, to screw things up, and then learn from your mistakes. But there's a big difference between taking a wrong turn while you're walking in your neighborhood and getting lost, and being dropped into a foreign country where you don't speak the language and not having any idea where you're going. You have to be able to ask questions to get home. And we didn't provide the baseline of language that let our students orient themselves. Put another way, giving your students the chance to experiment is great, but only if they're given enough tools. enough structure to give them a chance to actually succeed. Failure is only productive as a learning tool when your falls are limited to ones that you can pick yourself up from. So later iterations of our coding classes involved some basic instruction, providing some vocabulary, some context before sending our students out to experiment, and they were far more successful. And as I say that last sentence out loud, it sounds incredibly obvious, it's stupid. So please learn from my mistakes so you don't have to say things like that out loud to a group of strangers. But maybe the less intuitive application of the same idea in our own libraries, right, comes as we try out new programs and services. Makerspaces are obviously my focus, so I talk to a fair amount of people about them. And I am constantly surprised at the number of people who are set up for failure. Far too often I'll meet someone who had someone walk up to them and say, here's a 3D printer, learn how to use it and develop enough systems to offer it as a service in, say, a month, and I'll need you to be on the desk for 6 hours a day while you do that. Or they were given a mission that says, we'd like you to open up a space that serves kids, teens, adults, seniors, small businesses, entrepreneurs, people experiencing homelessness, quilters, record collectors, hedgehog breeders, and it would be great if you could include a CNC machine because the president of the Friends Foundation would really like to see one in there. And obviously, these are not reasonable demands. The parallel to my poor Coder Dojo kids is this: failure is a great way to learn, but it's best if we as an organization can do it in small ways with enough support built in that we can eventually succeed. We can ensure that these failures are small and manageable by setting realistic scopes of work, maybe just start a space with teens, and allocating enough resources to make sure it's a success. And far too often, we talk a lot about the financial and the capital resources, but not about the staff resources, the amount of training and learning that staff need to actually make a space a success for our communities. It's also important to remember, and I struggle with this, being the type of person that has 5 million ideas, but at age 40 still can't use a calendar successfully, that keeping failure manageable is also the only way that people doing innovative, amazing work, as I'm sure you all are doing, can keep getting the institutional support they need to keep going. Building up from monumental failures, one monumental failure, one large failure can be enough to leave people in an organization freaked out about any change at all for years afterwards. And if you're in an institution, if you're in a library that is change averse, you have to make sure that your experiments and failures start small so that you can build them up and build a culture where that change and where that innovation becomes part of what you do. I'd like to focus the last part of this talk on specifically on the people we serve. I've sort of been jumping back and forth between the two. But I'd like to talk about how we help our customers, our patrons, or users, whatever term you use at your library, to overcome failure. And probably to the organizers' relief, I'd finally touch on the theme of this entire conference. I feel like we've all been promised for a long time that technology will act as a lifter of all boats, as a smasher of social and class barriers. Access to the internet was going to put everyone on the same basis, equally able to compete in the free marketplace of ideas. My experiences have been that if you've ever been within 50 miles of a public library with a computer lab, you know what a tremendous load of BS that can be. If you've tried to help someone who just got out of a 10-year prison sentence, trying to reach a family member through Facebook, a Facebook account that they lost the password to, you know that's what a tremendous load of BS that sentiment is. If, like in Denver, Section 8 housing vouchers are done through an online lottery, and you've tried to help someone who physically cannot use a mouse and who's desperate for steady housing, try to fill out an online form, you know what a tremendous load of BS that it can be. The internet and technology do amazing things. It makes it possible for me to learn nearly anything I want to do almost instantly. It makes it possible for me to share my art and my music with millions of people all over the world. Its technological progress has made it possible for me to record songs in my bedroom, for me to be able to print out 3D objects on my kitchen table. It's amazing. The future is here, but as William Gibson has said, it isn't very evenly distributed. And while access to the internet is increasing, which public libraries have played a tremendous role in, access, in my belief, isn't what's going to actually close that gap between the patrons I see on a daily basis and the people who serve as volunteers in my programs. The true gap is between producers and consumers, the people who write the algorithms that increasingly govern our lives, and the people who are subject to those algorithms, or often the data set of those algorithms. And that's why a big focus of my work lately has focused on coding, small manufacturing, which are higher level skills that I feel can do the most impact to close that gap. But given how rapidly things change, there's no single tool or technology that we can teach to help our communities catch up. I think the only skill that will be truly important to be able to succeed in the future is being able to learn, to be able to drive your own learning. Part of me thinks that not even mastery is important, just being able to learn enough to solve a specific problem is enough. But as anyone who has taught themselves something knows, 99.9% of your time learning is doing the thing you're trying to learn wrong. Failure is how we learn anything at all. But what we've seen in our library, and I'd love to hear if it's the case at yours, is that persistence is the biggest barrier, that getting our patrons to keep pushing through when they encounter failure is the biggest barrier to keep people going. We're at a weird point where those who want to teach themselves, say, Python or JavaScript or just about anything else can go online and do it, given they have enough motivation and support. For instance, we attempted at our library an in-person online course. Sounds weird. But the idea was that people would sign up for this online Python course. They would do the work themselves. And then they would come in every week to discuss where they got stuck and solve problems together. But what we ran into was that within a week or two, people showed up just expecting us to cover what was in the online course. And digging deeper, we found that what happened was that people simply weren't able to do the work independently because once they ran into a problem, they froze. They didn't know what to do. And whether that was because they didn't have enough knowledge to be able to understand the resources given to them in the course, or whether they just needed someone there to help them through that failure, we ended up retooling that entire class into a classroom class with emphasizing basic programming concepts, tying those concepts into extra resources, but it became a traditional class. We've learned in our experiences at least 3 ways to help people navigate failure. And again, I'd love to hear from you guys if you found others, but I'd like to share the 3 sort of key takeaways we found to help our patrons move through failure. The first is being able to manage expectations. There's a surprising number of people who walk into our web development courses who appear to be under the impression that after the 8 hours of the course, they will be able to walk out and get a job as a front-end web developer. We like to talk a lot about, if I offered you an 8-hour class on Spanish and I told you I could get you a job as an interpreter immediately afterwards, you would think I was scamming you, right? The thing is the same for any programming language, for any skill at all. I have patrons walk in with an amazing idea, an amazing product. I was working with someone the other day who had invented, she was going to revolutionize the window blind industry I'm still not entirely clear how that was going to work, but she was under the impression that she would be able to walk in with her idea and walk out with a working product that day, and that's simply not how progress is made, right? Things take time, and being able to manage the expectation of the time and the effort invested is a very key feature. So we've begun building into every course that we teach a map of what mastery of a subject looks like. And the amount of time it takes, right? So this helps learners not see every small bump they run into as a signal that they need to stop. If people know that they're in it for the long haul from the beginning, they're better prepped psychologically to deal with those short-term stumbling blocks and keep moving through it. The next thing we've seen comes from our experience in the labs. So the vast majority of our time in the idea labs is open lab time. So people drop in with an idea, with a project, wanting to learn a specific thing, and there's staff there to help them and volunteers there to help them out. And our initial training for staff and volunteers in the labs was this gigantic Google spreadsheet of just all the equipment in the lab and how to use it, which is super important. It's a key part of the services we offer. But what we found was that when we structured our training like that, that often led to staff sitting for long periods of time during open lab staring at a 3D printer instead of actually talking to the people walking in the door. So we restructured our training so that it starts with culture first, that what makes a makerspace is the community of people that are in it, so who are helping each other learn. It means building relationships, and a big part of our culture in the Idea Labs is being willing to say, I don't know, which is strangely terrifying for a lot of people. But we always emphasize it by saying I don't know is perfectly fine as long as you follow it up with, but let's figure it out together. I don't know about you all out there in the internet, but I was a surly punk rock kid who didn't particularly enjoy school a lot, and I can only imagine what it was like for our customers who come in the door who were just like shuffled through underperforming schools. But it took me a long time to realize that the things that I loved and did in my spare time, the things that kept me going, those were learning. And this is something that I needed to do and I could do my entire life. One of the best ways we can help our patrons become learners, to move through those failures, is by modeling that behavior ourselves. Saying I don't know is a big part of that. And a big part of our lab culture is showing our patrons that we're learning alongside them. This lets us both manage expectations, as mentioned earlier, but it also lets us work side by side with our users to fail at something side by side with them and demonstrate to them that this, when you fail at a new skill, it's not the end of the world. It's the beginning of a new one, an exciting one where you can do new things. As an example of that, this was the sewing machine at our Montbello Idea Lab. Sewing is tremendously popular in that community, and when the machines broke, and the coordinator there and I have never actually fixed a sewing machine, but we decided it would be a fun opportunity to see what makes it work. So we took it apart and spent an hour during Open Lab working with the kids who came in to take it apart and try to get it working. We also learned how just steampunk style cool the inside of a sewing machine is, but we managed to get it working for about 10 minutes before it seized up again. But we learned a lot, and we got a lot of chance to teach kids how to experiment, respond to setbacks, and tinker with things. The last sort of takeaway I'd like to show is learning how to borrow. One of the more interesting things I've learned from developers the programmers, IT professionals who volunteer in a lot of our programs is how much working as a programmer relies on borrowing and repurposing already existing code. I'm not sure why I thought this, but I was under the impression for a long time that they were sort of like wizards and everything they built was created from scratch. But the vast majority of their work relies on seeing something someone has already done that's similar to what they want to do, tweaking it a little, and then sending it out in the world. This isn't a novel concept, and again, I'm kind of embarrassed it took me that long to figure it out. I mean, there's a whole phrase about not reinventing the wheel, right? We use this a lot in our daily lives. What I am a little disturbed about is how long it took us to work it into our curriculum development. A great way to coach learners through failure is feeding them small successes along the way, right? So that they're better able to deal with the long-term challenge of mastering the specific skill you want to teach them. Alongside that, especially with adult learners, they often come in with they're more focused on achieving a specific goal than mastering a skill, right? So we have a lot of people who come in for web development who want to make a website for their business. They don't necessarily want to learn HTML in the abstract. What we've done, how we've responded to that is by reworking a lot of our coding classes in particular to focus on not just how to write code, but how to read it. With a fairly minimal amount of background knowledge, you can start to parse samples of code that have been posted online, and you can borrow what someone has already done and make something happen really quickly. So that makes achieving small successes along the way much easier and keeps people engaged long enough to eventually master those big concepts that our initial lesson plans had only focused on, right? It also has the benefit of getting our learners to their goals that much more quickly. So in conclusion, I've tried really hard to be super professional, but I would have betrayed myself if I didn't include at least one Adventure Time GIF in my presentation. The GIF's not actually playing, weak. Anyway, but really, I hope some of this was interesting and or useful. I'd just like to wrap up by saying that there's libraries are constantly being pushed to do new things, whether it's through management trends or budget cuts or political wins. We're constantly having to evolve, and that means learning how to fail successfully. But I want to encourage us all to fail with our eyes open to both the risks of failure and the amazing rewards that you can pull from it if we're honest and open about how and why we failed. Again, thank you so much for inviting me to talk. My contact info is there if you'd like to ask me anything about makerspaces especially. I will give the warning that I've seen a couple people following me on Twitter already. I will warn you that my Twitter feed is approximately 5,000% political talk because, well, 2017. But if you're comfortable with that, please let's talk on Twitter. Otherwise, you can email me, and I'm always happy to talk with fellow people doing good work. I have plenty of time for questions if that's an option, or.
Yeah, we have some time for questions. Thank you, Nate. That was really good. James has already submitted that he loves Jake the dog, so he appreciates your Adventure Time reference.
Excellent.
And I had to step away for a second, so I hope I'm not saying something you already said, but your presentation reminded me of one of my favorite quotes from Samuel Beckett, that ever tried, ever failed. No matter, try again, fail better. And I think this really plays into that. And like you said, the only way we're going to get better is if we fail first and don't give up. So do we have any, James just called me a nerd with a lot of E's. Thank you, James. Do we have any constructive feedback besides picking on me? But I mean, that's warranted too. Nothing's coming in, but
That's fine.
I just want to thank you again. I think that was really good, and I hope everyone took something away from that. I think that was very uplifting.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot for having me.
All right, well, like he said, if